year was 1940. And on May 15th, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, he got a call in the middle of the night that woke him from his sleep. And it wasn't the good type of call. It was the leader of France on the phone with this horrible news. He said, "Winston, I think we've been defeated. I think we've lost the war." See, the Allied forces had miscalculated the route that the Germans were going to take. They thought that they had prepped and they had secured the perimeter. But the Nazi forces, they found a break through a forest region, and they started pouring in through the thousands. It was looking really, really bleak. There was only one possible way to get the 400,000 Allied forces out of that region to safety. And that was through a little northeastern city of France called Dunkirk. You may have seen the movie a couple of years ago that highlighted these couple of extremely intense weeks of World War II that changed the course of history. The only problem with going through the city of Dunkirk, although it was the only way, was that it was going to require the troops to sail across the English Channel. The English Channel was known for being the worst water conditions to sail across, notoriously choppy. But it literally was the only way out. Hundreds of thousands of Allied troops just waiting like sitting ducks. The Germans were pouring in. It seemed like a suicide mission to even try to go out through Dunkirk, said Winston Churchill, but it was their only hope. And Winston Churchill is recorded as saying that he hoped at best they'd be able to get 20,000 men home through the Dunkirk rescue mission. So what happened next, nobody saw coming. King George of Great Britain, he summoned the entire country to a national day of prayer. On May 24th, he addressed the nation with these words. He said, "Let us with one heart and soul, humbly but confidently, commit our cause to God and ask his aid." As a nation, unified, they committed this cause, they committed this crisis to God. They petitioned and they begged for a miracle. And old photos will show just hundreds of thousands of British people lined up somberly outside of cathedrals and churches, begging God to rescue their beloved troops. And the next day, 800 civilian sailors, they set out in their own privately owned little boats. These were fishermen. These were untrained sailors. Some of their boats didn't even have compasses to point them in the right direction of Dunkirk. But they were so moved to be part of this rescue mission that they were even willing to sail where no novice sailor should go across the English Channel because the conditions were so bad. But nonetheless, they went over those choppy waters. Meanwhile, the Allied troops were lining up the beaches of Dunkirk. I think we have a photo to show you of that. They were just sitting and waiting, frenzied and hoping for some sort of rescue mission. But you see, they were also at such great threat of an aerial attack. They were just like sitting ducks. And then something happened. While the nation of Great Britain clasped its hands in prayer, begging God for a miracle, those troops looked up and the sky got dark. Heavy clouds began to pour in, and an unforecasted storm was unleashed on the beaches of Dunkirk. This was not planned, and the stormy conditions grew so bad that Hitler had to ground his German aircrafts. And although the German forces on the ground were only 10 miles, their tanks were only 10 miles outside of the beaches of Dunkirk, Hitler did the unthinkable. He halted them. And for 3 days, the German troops did not advance by air or by ground. Historians call this perhaps one of the greatest tactile errors of wartime ever. They can't explain Hitler's logic here. But for those 3 days while the storms raged, boat by boat, soldier by soldier was moved into these little civilian fisher boats and safely sailed back to shore of their home country into safety. And get this. It's reported that the waters of the English Channel for those 3 days were eerily smooth. It was almost like this glass sheet across the waters. What had been known to everybody as the worst conditions to sail for 3 days, they were perfect. And so remember how Winston Churchill hoped at best that 20,000 of the Allied troops would be rescued. Well, after 3 days, when the storm lifted and the Germans went to encroach upon Dunkirk, 338,000 of the Allied troops had been rescued and sailed back safely to the shores of Great Britain. It was literally a miracle. So much so that in history books, it's often referred to as the miracle at Dunkirk. I love what one British soldier, we have a picture of their smiling faces as they sailed back to the shores of their home country, and they were greeted by cheers of rejoicing Brits who had been praying so earnestly for their rescue. And as they sailed back to this welcome, one soldier, James Bradley, said, "This is Britain. You're worth fighting for." What was it that moved a secular government to call for a national move of prayer? What was it that caused these government leaders to rally all of their people and to petition and to plead with God for a miracle? What was it? It was 2 things. They realized they had something worth fighting for. Their hundreds of thousands of troops stranded. And they realized that their human efforts couldn't rescue these men. They realized that they needed a miracle. They needed help. They needed God's kingdom to come in that specific way. See, that's what intercessory prayer at its core is. It's about people realizing a huge need, a huge gap, and filling that gap, petitioning God with prayers and pleas to say, "God, please bring your kingdom right here, right now. We are in dire need of help." See, intercessory prayer is more than just another type of prayer. It's actually a radical way for followers of Jesus to love people and to love the world that God has put us in. Because what happens in intercessory prayer is that we declare someone or something is worth loving, is worth fighting for. Richard Foster, he writes this. He says, "If we truly love people, we will desire for them more than it is within our power to give them. And that will lead us to pray." If we truly love people, we're going to want more for them than what we can give in our own human strength. That will lead us to pray. So this morning, as we continue in our series about prayer for normal people, we're going to be diving into intercessory prayer, which is sometimes known as petitionary prayer because it simply means bringing petitions and requests to God on behalf of someone or something else. And my guess is that if you're a follower of Jesus, you've heard about this type of prayer before. You've probably done it, maybe at some prayer nights or something like that. But I just get this sense that maybe we don't take intercessory prayer all that seriously. Because we doubt that our prayers have the chance to really change anything. But as we'll see today, it's actually God's unique design for his kingdom to come to earth in and through the pleas of his people, in and through you and me, and our requests to him. I mean, it's one of the truly great mysteries of the Bible, how God is responsible It maintains control within history, but still makes room for our prayers and our actions to be responsible within history as well. But we see over and over countless examples through Scripture that this is a way God often works. God uses the prayers and the pleas of his people to bring his kingdom to earth. And if you've been with the Bridge for a while, or if you go on our website, you'll notice that this is actually our vision statement as a church. That we would see God's kingdom come in the Chino Valley as it is in heaven. Why? Why is that our vision? Because we have realized that the Chino Valley is worth fighting for. We've realized that the children here and the youth and the marriages and the elderly and our city leaders and our school and this church, that it's all worth fighting for. And if something's worth fighting for, it's worth praying for. It's worth interceding for. And so, as we look at intercessory prayer, it is deeply important as followers of Jesus that we engage in this type of prayer. But more so, for us as a church corporately, walking in intercessory prayer, and it's part of our call. It is the means in which we are going to see God's kingdom come in the Chino Valley as it is in heaven. So you might be wondering, well, what are these examples? What is the evidence that we know that God works to bring his kingdom to earth through prayer? One of my favorite examples is found in the Old Testament. If we're going to look back at 2 Chronicles in chapter 7, the Lord appears to Solomon and he gives him this promise. He says this, "If my people," that's you and me, "who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, I will hear from heaven. I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land." He says, if my people will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will respond by forgiving their sin and healing their land. There are no maybes here. I don't see an if. I don't see a contingency. It's a promise. As Pete Greig writes, he says, the forgiveness of sins and the healing of the land are entirely contingent on the intercession of God's people. Friends, intercessory prayer is God's means. It's his mechanism that he has set up. It's his way for us as his children to plead with him, to bring the kingdom into our reality. Last week when we looked at the Lord's Prayer, we looked at the part that addresses our daily needs. God, give us this day our daily bread. Today we look at our corporate need. God, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And it's worth noting, this prayer, this phrase, was actually a prayer for a regime change. It's been a prayer ever since Jesus taught his disciples for the status quo to be challenged, for the current system to be flipped on its head, for God's kingdom and rule and reign to be in the governing chair. I mean, is this not the prayer that we are desperate for right now? In this cultural moment, as a nation, this is the prayer that we have been needing for his kingdom to come. Because no matter what side you're on, if you've watched the news at all, you realize that the current system, it's not working. It's not working. God's people are hurting. We need a change. We need the only hope that can sustain long change and restoration and justice. That's only God's kingdom. It's not in a political figure. It's in Jesus sitting on the throne and ruling and reigning. I think if I'm honest, a lot of times when we find ourselves in really heightened cultural moments like the one that we're in right now, it's like the issues just feel so big that I kind of feel like a little ant looking up at a giant rocky cliff. Like how on earth am I going to scale this cliff? It just seems so big. It seems so overwhelming. And so I think the temptation oftentimes for us in these situations of overwhelm is to think, God, my prayers aren't going to do any good, so why pray? What good is my little feeble prayer going to do for the civil unrest? What good is my little feeble prayer going to do for our government leaders in the upcoming election and for COVID and for our schools to reopen and for racial equality to actually happen? For these burning wildfires to be put out? What good is my little feeble prayer going to do for the insane polarization that I'm seeing all around me between my neighbors, people I love, going at it, tearing each other apart? God, what good are my little prayers going to do? This just feels so big. It feels so overwhelming. My prayers aren't powerful enough to scale this cliff. And if you've gotten to that point, let me affirm you in that. You're right. Your prayers aren't big enough, powerful enough in and of themselves. But what you need to know is this. The one your prayers are going to, the one that you are pleading to and with, and his power has always been enough. It's not about the power of our prayers. They do feel small and weeble, but it is about the power of the one that we are praying and petitioning. God, do something, come. Parker's favorite toy right now, it's this train set. It's this awesome train set that Pastor Kaylin handed down to us. And every morning when Parker wakes up, what he loves to do is he loves to start building his train track in his room. And he's got these pieces that are straight, like this, and they fit together really easily, just pretty straightforward. And he can do all of these pieces on his own. But the pieces that Parker really likes to play with are these cool, adventurous pieces like this bridge. But Parker can't connect this bridge to the flat pieces because, see, there's an elevation change. There's a special piece required to go in the gap between this straight piece and the heightened bridge. And Parker can't quite click that piece in by himself just yet. And so what he does every morning when he gets to that point, when he wants to connect the big, fun, adventurous piece to the rest of his pieces, is he goes downstairs, he finds me or he finds Mark, and he grabs us by the hand and he takes us up to his room and he says, "Mama, Dada, build choo-choo. Mama, Dada, build choo-choo." And we get up there and we see, sure enough, the gap. The gap between the pieces that he can connect in his own strength and ability and the pieces that he wants to connect. He doesn't have that missing piece. He doesn't know how to connect that missing piece. And so we grab that missing piece. It's this little curvy like hill piece. And we click it in. We step in the gap and we click in the missing piece. See, when you engage in intercessory prayer, that's what we do. As followers of Jesus, we stand in the gap. We fill in that missing piece with the world around us in our current reality to God's reality. We stand in the gap and we petition God for his kingdom to come, for his reality to flood ours. If you tuned in last week, you remember that Pastor Brock shared this really powerful story. And he provided such a great example for us as followers of Jesus of how we actually go about standing in the gap for others. He was speaking at this national youth conference when this paralyzed teenage girl asked him to pray for her. Her reality was paralysis. She couldn't walk. And she desperately wanted to get strength and feeling and mobility back in her body. And so she asked Brock to come and pray for her. And Brock stepped in this place. He stepped in this gap piece. He inhibited this liminal space between creation and creator, between glory and dirt, pleading for God to reconcile the two together. Say, God, your kingdom is full healing. Like that's what we're headed to. That's not what this dear girl is experiencing. There's a gap between them. God, would you please come? Would you reconcile these two realities? Would your reality of healing flood her experience? If you remember, he said he petitioned God for her healing, not once, not twice, multiple times, until she started to get feeling back in her feet and eventually started to stand up. And this girl walked. She experienced full healing in that moment. We don't always see petitionary prayers answered like that. Sometimes they take longer, but sometimes we do. And so my question for you today is not, are you being called to do what Pastor Brock did? Are you being called to stand in the gap for someone or something around you? Because that's not a question if you're a follower of Jesus. The answer to that question is yes. Absolutely. That's not negotiable. If you are filled with the Spirit of God, you are filled with an intercessory spirit. That's part of our calling as followers of Jesus. As Pete Greig writes, he says to be filled with the Spirit is to be filled with an interceding spirit. Here's how you know. Here's how you know that intercessory spirit is in you. He says, where you once couldn't see the problems of the world around you or you didn't care, now you're sensitized to them. They break your heart. You're sensitized. Notice he doesn't say outraged or cynical or bitter. Like that's different than being sensitized. Where you once maybe didn't care about your friends and their future, you want them desperately to know Jesus. I was talking with a girl the other week who leads Alpha, which is a course designed to introduce Jesus and what the basics are of following him and to people who aren't following him. She leads this course at a church in New York City, and she said she invited 30 of her friends to come and join her during COVID to do Alpha online. She made 30 FaceTime calls to her friends to explain what this is, what she wanted them to experience. That's the mark of being filled with the Spirit. We desperately want others to come into God's kingdom and to experience this other way of life, true freedom. When you're filled with an intercessory spirit, your life takes the shape of this single prayer: God, your kingdom come. To be an intercessor, it's the greatest invitation of your life. I mean, do you want influence? Talk about influence. Here it is. God is saying, humble yourself. Sit with me. I want to hear your cries and your pleas for the reality in which you inhabit. Does your life take the shape of that prayer? Your kingdom come. Or if you're honest, this praying for the things around you, when you have time or when you think about it, but your prayer life tends to be more self-focused. And there's a place for that. God wants to hear our daily needs. He wants to respond to you. But when you're out and about, are you looking for ways for the kingdom to come? It's as simple as like when you're shopping, when you're out to eat, when you're taking a walk in your neighborhood, are your eyes open and sensitized to the possible areas around you where God's kingdom could come, where you're seeing injustices or brokenness? You know that we're not just supposed to look past that. We're actually supposed to do something about that. We're supposed to say, God, I'm recognizing that something is not as you intended it to be. Would you come into that? Would you come into that person's life? Would you come and free them from that addiction? Would you come into my workplace? Would you come into my hurting marriage? Would you come into my failing government or school system? Would you come? Because this isn't part of your design and plan. We need you. I want to challenge you today You know that we're in an insane cultural moment where the stakes feel high, the temperature is intense, and it's probably only going to continue in that direction as we head into election season. If you feel yourself resonating with that little ant who looks up at the giant cliff and says, "What difference are my little prayers going to make to all of this?" I want to challenge you to see prayer as the most important action you could take. Because I think we oftentimes think, "Oh, well, I'm just going to start doing something. I'm going to act. I'm going to do something fast. I'm going to go after it. And maybe I'll pray about it later." But prayer just feels like boring and complacent. I'm going to go out and I'm going to do something about it. And hear me loud and clear. Prayer and action do go hand in hand, and we need followers of Jesus to be action-oriented and to go out and to be the hands and feet of our King in our neighborhoods. But we often see prayer as just this optional thing, or as this last resort, or as this crisis hotline. But prayer is God's designed first response for us. And remember that if you truly love or care about something or someone, you will want for them more than what you can do for them, and that will lead you to pray. Consider prayer this way. As theologian Karl Barth puts it, he says, "To clasp the hands in prayer is the beginning of an uprising against the disorder of the world." To clasp our hands in prayer is where the uprising against the disorder and the brokenness that you and I are encountering, this is where it begins. It begins in prayer. Our pushback against it, our protest against the world's brokenness and its injustices, it starts and ends in prayer. If we actually believed that, perhaps these situations might look a little different. Perhaps the next time you become really angered about an issue that you see or an injustice, instead of angrily typing about it on a Facebook status or resharing some stuff on Instagram, perhaps you would be moved to clasp your hands in prayer about that thing that's causing you such anger inside. Or perhaps the next time that you're out and you're driving behind somebody who's got a Trump 2020 sticker and you don't want that, or they've got a Biden-Harris sticker and you don't want that, that instead of using your hands to let them know how you feel when you pass them, you clasp your hands in prayer for your enemy, for those on the opposite side, remembering that that's still your brother or your sister that God has made in His own image. What if the next time that your hands hold a sign at a protest, it doesn't stop there, that they clasp in prayer after and before and during, because you recognize that your action is very limited. The impact of your action is very limited. But the true power, if you really want to see an uprising or justice break through into that issue, that cause that you care deeply about, that's only accomplished through prayer. When we humble ourselves and submit our petitions and our pleas to the God of the universe, He promises to forgive our sin and to heal our land. We must pray. We must act. We do both as followers of Jesus. But prayer is where the inbreaking of God's kingdom comes. Lastly, I'm going to invite John back up on stage. I want you to consider the greatest act of intercession ever in the history of the world as we know it. The greatest act of intercession, you and I were on the receiving end for. So there was a point where God saw, much like Parker's train tracks, that there was this giant gap. Creation and creator were separated. This was not as God intended it to be. Why? Because our sin had created this wedge between us. This grieved God's heart deeply. He saw the world and its brokenness. This is not how he intended it to be for us, his children. He didn't intend for us to go astray and for sin to come and to wedge its way between creator and creation. And even though we were responsible for that, God was so moved to compassion to do something to fill the gap. He didn't just send anyone to fill the gap or any remedy. No, he gave us the best. He sent himself. Jesus, God with flesh on, who came to stand in that gap for you and for me with one mission: to seek and to restore what was lost, to reconcile the sinner to the sinless one. And it was only possible for God taking the weight of what stood in that gap, taking that weight of the sin upon his own shoulders and taking it to the cross. Someone had to pay for that debt that we owed but could never pay on our own. Someone had to do it. And it cost him. Oh, did it cost him? The pain, the suffering, the heartbreak. God lost his own son to fill the gap for you and for me. And that should cause us to think, God, you are the most powerful being in all of the universe. You could have thought of any solution. You could have thought of any way to fix that gap. Why did you choose a way that involves so much suffering and heartbreak when you could have done it anyway? Here's why. Because God saw you. He saw you. Just like the soldier at Dunkirk who sailed back ashore, he said, you are worth fighting for. And that, friends, is why the invitation for us to be intercessors stands today. You are worth fighting for. You've received God's greatest act of intercession. Now the invitation is before us to intercede for those things and those people around you right now. Because just like you, they're worth fighting for.